Hey guys, welcome back and welcome to today's video. Today we're going to talk about the history of the LG enV phone. And I've done a video similar to this in the past for the LG chocolate phone, and I'm really excited to do one for the enV phone now. And if you clicked on the video, you probably either had this phone and loved it, or you really loved this phone and never got to have one. But I think there is some pretty fun things to learn about this, and it's kind of fun just to reminisce and hear about some of the things you maybe already know about the phone, just kind of rekindle some memories. But without further ado, let's get started on today's video, the history of the LG enV phone. All right, so the first phone in the enV phone legacy starts before the original enV, and this is called the V by LG, and the actual name is the VX 9800. This phone launched on Verizon. The release date for this phone was all the way back in September of 2005. So on September 20th of 2005, the phone launched on Verizon's website exclusively, and then the following October, which was just a month later, it launched in stores. The price on a 2-year contract was $299.99, and it was criticized at the time for being a very high-priced phone. But in all fairness, this was kind of, starting its own kind of category on Verizon as far as what this phone was. So, when you're the first, I guess you can kind of set the price point. But if you look back at reviews, a lot of people did criticize the phone for this. The phone's release color was in silver, and it did not get any additional colors in its lifespan, so the original color was the only option you could have. If you look at it, it really does resemble the enV. I don't think it would be too hard to figure out that this phone came before the enV. It was a thick phone, so was the enV, but this phone was even thicker. And one thing I found kind of quirky about this phone is, with the age of it, micro SD I believe was around, but this phone actually used a mini SD. So this would look similar to the adapter that you would actually put the micro SD card into now. So it's like this very big card, and that's what that phone used for additional storage. One other thing I found interesting about these phones early on in the enV series is the space keys. There's actually 2 of them when you open the phone, and they were on both the right and left hand side of the keyboard. It was not centered, and there were 2. And, I guess at the time, this was just normal. This phone, the V by LG, entered the market. There were phones that were similar to it on other networks, but this was really a pioneer for Verizon. It was one of the first of its kind, like I had said before. But if you look back at the similar time period in 2004, 2005, there was the Motorola A630, and also LG had another flip messaging phone, or actually I should say sliding messaging phone. It was the LG F9100, and that was on Singular, and the Motorola that I had spoke about was on T-Mobile. But yeah, for Verizon, this was like a brand new thing. And there's a fun ad to watch too. This phone eventually was for $199.99. Maybe that came after some criticism of the price, or maybe as it aged, the price went down, because that's very typical for a phone. But the last thing I'll mention about this one too is it had a proprietary charging port, and you'll see this on many other phones at the time, pretty much all phones at the time. Each brand had their own kind of, proprietary charger. There were a few. I know Motorola seemed like to be the one that used the mini USB, but yeah, at the time, this wasn't even anything to gripe the phone for, because pretty much every LG phone had its own kind of special charger. So yeah, with the V, it's really fun to see how this started, because the design language really progressed from this in a lot of ways, but in a lot of ways it retained it throughout the entire enV lineup throughout all the years. But moving straight on from the V by LG came, I'm sure, what is to be probably everyone's favorite in this entire enV family. Maybe not, but it definitely is my favorite, and that is the LG enV, the official first LG enV. And the official model name was VX9900, so it came right after the 9800, so it was clear that this was the next iteration of the V, now called the enV. Very clever. Moving on from the V, I doubt they really anticipated it being called the enV for the next one, so I think that's really cool and creative. The release date was November of 2006. The starting price on this one was a lot less than the V by LG was when it first came out, and that being at $149.99 after a $50 mail-in rebate on a 2-year contract. Now, the initial color this phone launched in was silver, and it also eventually released in 2 other colors, and they were the orange color that launched in June of 2007, and the green came in August/September of 2007 as well. And this phone really just was a huge seller on Verizon. I mean, like I said in the beginning of this video, you've probably heard of the enV line, and pretty much anyone that has used a phone has heard of the enV line. Even if you weren't into phones, this is a phone that you knew what it was, even if you weren't really that interested in them. And I think a big thing to do with that is because it appealed to a lot of people, and it was just pretty much like the best messaging phone you could get. This phone got tons of media attention. It was seen in music videos. It was seen in TV. Celebrities used it. It was just a really iconic phone and was just really a fun phone to use. Again, this phone became basically a sleeker and more refined version of the V in a lot of ways. It still had that proprietary charger, the 2 space keys that were not centered. They were on both the right and the left-hand side, just like the V were. One thing that I think is kind of fun too is that on the silver model, when you opened the phone, in the top left-hand corner, there was a key that was orange that was very similar to what would come to be the next color, which was the orange enV. But this key originally said email for the original silver enV when it launched. And when the orange and also the green came out, that orange key eventually said enV and became more of a function menu. So I'm curious to see too if the future silver models say the enV key, but on the one I have here, it does say email. So I found that pretty interesting that even though the orange and the silver were the same phone, and the green one as well, that 2 of the models, the orange and green, both had a slightly different function on one of their keys. And also, this phone did start using micro SD, so it used that smaller card size, the one we're still familiar with using today. All right, and moving right along. So in November of 2007, the LG Voyager, the VX10000, was released. And this phone really changed a lot. This was, at the time, considered to be the next enV. It followed right along in the naming scheme of the VX9800 to 9900 to 10000. So, at this time, we didn't even know about an enV2, which would come. But this phone was perceived to be the next enV. It had a lot of similarities with the previous 2 models, and it was a huge upgrade. The design language really changed. It was a lot slimmer, and this phone did launch for $299 with a 2-year contract, and it launched originally in the color black, and then it was also released in an additional color of titanium in August of 2008, so almost a year after it came out. And yeah, as you can just tell, this phone was very sleek. The design to me and to a lot of other people was just beautiful. It had soft touch, it had chrome accents, and like I said, it was slimmer. And a lot of people at the time were calling this the iPhone killer, which is kind of silly to think about considering the huge difference in marketing and who these phones are really for. But when the original iPhone launched, it was also kind of its own thing. So the market really wasn't sure where it was going. And with this phone launching with a touchscreen, even though it was a resistive touchscreen, which meant it wasn't as responsive, but for fair game, Verizon didn't have the iPhone. They launched this. So this was kind of, considered the iPhone killer, even though it really, really was not. But yeah, this phone had a touchscreen on the front, so it got rid of that button style numeric keypad, and a lot of things changed, but it also did retain, again, the 2 space keys on the left and the right hand side had not yet been centered. This phone also surprisingly had an antenna, which I don't think many people really knew about unless they owned the phone. It pulled out of the side, and it was a pretty long antenna that was used for, I believe, the TV subscription that you could sign up for Verizon. I don't know how many people really utilized this, but the phone did have an antenna, whereas the previous two enV phones did not have a visible extendable antenna. The phone also used micro SD. This phone still featured a proprietary port, which was surprising to me. I thought at this time I never actually owned the Voyager, but looking back, I had assumed that this phone used micro USB to charge because the new NV2 that would launch in the spring would feature that. For some reason, I thought the Voyager was the first one, but it was not. Still use a proprietary charger. And overall, this phone was just a huge step forward. I mean, if you were alive on planet Earth in 2007 during that holiday season, you probably really wanted one of these. And if you had one, I'm sure people were just like amazed that you did, because this phone was definitely the top of the line, and I would say absolutely the best option you could possibly get on Verizon for quite a long time to follow. And this phone, I had not mentioned on the other two, but most basic phones on Verizon, and I think in general, they use what's called a Brew operating system. So instead of running Android or iOS, basic phones run like this menu grid type thing that they call Brew. And what was really unique on the Voyager is that it still ran that, but it had a custom theme placed over it. And the icons and everything just looked really, really nice. And it was just a really different experience to use, even though it still functioned very similar to any other basic phone at the time. But it had a skin basically placed over it. It was very dark and sophisticated, and it had a lot of like red accents you can see. And one thing that was interesting to look back on is that when the titanium color released for the phone that following August of 2008, they released an update for the phone. So it wasn't an over-the-air update. I believe you had to take in your phone to the Verizon stores, and that's how they did updates back then before like smartphones came around. But you could take your phone in, and when the titanium one released, it did have an updated menu system that reflected the titanium color, and it did have some improvements, and it became a lot more kind of clean and crisp looking. But if you took in your original Black Voyager, I do believe that it would update its menu to that cleaner, newer version of the software. I don't know if that was to fix bugs or not, or if it was just cosmetics, but I definitely preferred the original software. I thought it just really fit the phone better, but I can see why the titanium had its own look as well. And this also followed in the alignment of software for the LG Dare at the time, so it was kind of transitioning more of looking like a Dare on the front. But that is a little sidetracked, but it is interesting to see the lifespan of the Voyager. All right, so after the Voyager, the LG NV2, the official successor was the VX9100, and that was released in April of 2008 with a starting price of $129.99 after a $50 mail-in rebate on a 2-year contract. And this was the first time that an enV phone was released in 2 colors. Now, it only came in these 2 colors. There were no additional colors to come in its lifetime, but it did release in 2 options, in maroon and black. This phone was a lot smaller and a lot more compact than the original enV, and it did lose a little bit of functionality on the front screen, so you couldn't do as much, but this was a drastic change to the original enV, and I want to say this might have been more popular than the original enV. I want to say it sold more, but like my favorite, just because it's the original, is still the enV, but I think for a lot of people, this might have been their favorite. The NV2 was kind of a shock to some people, I believe, at the time, because like I said, they kind of assumed the Voyager was the next enV. But it is interesting to see that its naming scheme didn't go to 11,000. So this was clearly, its own thing. It wasn't trying to be a new Voyager or anything like that, because there were a ton of differences in these phones at the time. But it created a really neat lineup, because the Voyager was kind of considered the touchscreen enV, and then the NV2 was like the official, new version of the enV. And about this phone, it's featured some of the similar design language as the Voyager that had released months back in November, but it had the soft touch feel. It had a sleeker, slimmer design. It had those chrome accents. It was just a lot more refined in basically every way. But, the only thing is it did lose the outside screen functionality by quite a bit. And it did remove the flash. I know the Voyager didn't have a flash either, but looking back, I guess I hadn't realized that the NV2 didn't have a flash and that the V and the NV did. So that was kind of interesting. One thing that did also change is this is the first time that I had mentioned before that this phone now featured micro USB. So that was a really cool change to see. And it did feature the two space keys, still not centered. They're both on the right and left hand side. I still don't know why people didn't question this back then. Maybe they did, but this was actually the first enV phone that I used. I wasn't a texter at the time, but my previous phone, my first phone, had actually broke, and I pre-ordered this phone and got it the day it came out. And yeah, I didn't question it either because I wasn't really texting that much, which is really silly when you think about it, to have an NV2 and not be texting, but it was a really cool phone. Okay, I really wanted it. So definitely a lot of cool memories with that phone for me. Um, but yeah, that was the NV2. It sold super well. One odd thing when the phone aged is I never experienced this, but I really didn't even own the phone that long. But a lot of my friends had the phone, and their front keys actually would fall off of the phone. I don't have any pictures to show of my any personal photos to show, but leave a comment if you had this happen to yours. But the actual number keys were in a row, and if one fell off, they would eventually would all fall off. And I noticed a lot of people's envies look like that over the years. I don't know how it happened. I don't know if maybe they dropped it a lot, but I just wonder if you took good care of it, did that happen to yours? Did that happen to everybody's? And also this happened on the Voyager, where the chrome would chip pretty bad over time, but you know that's neither here nor there. It didn't really affect the initial reactions, but it is kind of interesting to see how phones age, and that was just my take. I wanted to include that because I haven't really seen any other phones that have had all the front buttons fall off of it. And one last thing about the NV2 that's pretty interesting is that this phone actually in Canada on TELUS, I believe it was, released as the LG Kibo. So the LG NV2 looked pretty much identical to what was called the LG Kibo in Canada. And yeah, that's all I really have to say about that. It came in the same two colors, but I believe the maroon was called pomegranate or something. Okay, now here's where things get kind of fun. This is the launch of the LG NV3 and the launch of the LG NV Touch. These were announced at the same time. They released a week apart from each other. We'll start with the NV3. This was the VX9200. It was released in May of 2009, at the very, very end of May. It was $129.99 after a $50 mail-in rebate on a 2-year contract. It released in two colors. It released in blue and maroon, and those were available at the start of its launch. And it, again, just like the NV2, did not come in any further colors. This phone as well released in Canada as the Kibo 2, and I believe it also came in blue, but instead of maroon, it came in a very light pink color. I think it was just called pink, not 100% sure, but it did come in those colors. And also talking about the NV Touch, this came out a week later, but it was in June of 2009. It was June 5th, and I think the NV3 launched on May 29th, the very end of May. The NV Touch was the VX11000. So this is very interesting because the LG Voyager was always unofficially, in the LG NV family. It was just assumed this is part of this line. But this is a clear successor to the Voyager. So it was kind of fun at the time because these phones were the first time there were ever two offerings, official offerings of an NV phone. And with this being the 11,000 instead of the 10,000, this you would think would be called the Voyager 2, which it actually was supposed to be called the Voyager 2. They didn't plan on naming this the NV Touch. They were going to keep it, the Voyager line and the NV line, still in the same family, but, very kind of distinct. But they went with the NV Touch and brought it along officially into the NV family. I don't think they did this by choice. What actually happened was, I think it was called Platonics or something like that, had Bluetooth headsets. I believe they actually still make them. But at the time, they were using the Voyager name for their Bluetooth headsets, and LG actually used the Voyager name and was no longer allowed to use that name because Plantronics already owned that right to that name, and with them both being in related to cell phones, I believe that was what was restricting them from actually being able to use it again. So they went with enV Touch instead of Voyager 2, but this phone was slated to be called the Voyager 2. This phone was $149.99 after a $50 mail-in rebate on a 2-year contract. And the enV Touch only released in one color. It never got additional colors. I'm going to call it brown. I don't think it ever had an official color name because it wasn't sold in any other options, but it was definitely more of like a beige, a neutral, like a brown color. And I own this phone as well. I own the enV3 too, but yeah, the enV Touch was a really special phone. This definitely improved upon a lot of ways, but we will talk about them together as the enV3 and enV Touch. And these phones were marketed as app friendly. And again, here comes Verizon trying to compete with the iPhone a little bit because Verizon still did not have the iPhone at the time. And I don't necessarily think that the target customer that was looking for these enV phones, they weren't really looking at iPhones yet because they weren't an option on Verizon, but they were trying to compete and kind of bring some of those keywords, like apps and stuff like that. And yeah, these phones were marketed as app friendly, but they really weren't any different than any other phones that Verizon had at the time as far as apps went. So for them, you could download these apps that you paid for monthly, like anywhere from like $1.99 or 99 cents, but you could buy like games and stuff like that. They didn't run very good, but through Verizon's old service called Vcast, you could basically do that on most phones at the time. But I think they were just, kind of trying to make these seem super modern, app friendly type of a thing. But both of these phones were very, very nice improvements to the 2 previous models that they were designed to replace. So with these, they featured a very similar design to each other. They had a soft touch back with this kind of cool design of these squares. They both featured, for the first time, centered space keys when you open the phone for the keyboard. This is a pretty big deal that I don't think many people really talked about, but it had one space key in the middle. It's like a very standard looking keyboard. And the enV Touch actually featured for the first time on an enV phone the 3.5mm standard headphone jack, so you did not need an adapter to a 2.5mm, so you could plug in your own headphones. I remember getting music on this was super easy. It looked really nice. You could do like a cover flow type thing on the touch screen on the enV when it was closed on the enV Touch. And both phones are really loud. enV Touch featured Dolby sound and a Snyder Cruisinox lens, and both returns with the flash feature, so they both had flashes for their cameras. Overall, this was just a really nice refinement to both the enV2 and the Voyager. The enV Touch was by far the best phone you could buy on Verizon. I think it even, outweighed a lot of the smartphone options at the time. This phone was feature packed and it was a very solid phone. And one other thing to mention about the enV3 that was a big improvement over the enV2 is it did gain back a lot more function to the external screen. So you could do a lot more in the front similar to you could on the original LG enV. So that was really nice. And aside from the huge success for both of these phones, again, I wish I could see actual numbers, but I feel like these again sold even better than enV2's did. I really am not sure which one was actually the best selling phone out of the entire enV lineup, but it's kind of a toss up. I know the enV3 and enV Touch were everywhere. So many people had these phones. You probably had one of these phones, or you definitely knew someone that had one of these. And the enV Touch was a really fun phone to use. I really liked it. The only kind of sour taste I think that eventually came into play for both the enV3 and the enV Touch is Verizon originally launched these phones as feature phones, and they kind of went through a weird time period throughout the phone's lifetime where eventually Verizon was requiring what was called multimedia phones, which were kind of like advanced feature phones like the enV3 and enV Touch, to have a data pack requirement attached to them. It wasn't the full-fledged $30 data pack requirement for a smartphone, but they were requiring people to have a mandatory $10 multimedia phone data pack. And this didn't apply to like the enV or the enV2 because these were considered older phones and not as capable. But with these new ones being marketed as app friendly, they really wanted people to think of these as kind of a smartphone, even though they definitely were not. And a lot of people weren't happy about that because they didn't want a smartphone, and they've used the enV and enV2 in the past, and these phones really didn't differentiate that much in features from those phones. So it was like a very confusing, why does the enV2 not require, but the enV3 type of a thing. But yeah, so that's kind of in the history of the enV phone, is Verizon was really starting to kind of change their thought process on, what is a smartphone? What should we be charging for these? I don't think that really deterred people from buying the phone. They were so popular that even when that became a requirement, I don't think that really slowed it down too much. The only other thing I have to say about the enV Touch is that when I owned it, and I know a lot of people in forums talked about it, is the outside screen glitched a lot. The colors would invert very strangely, and the whole screen would become green. You could still see everything, but everything was literally green or blue, and you'd have to like open and close the phone a few times for it to go away. There were tons of software updates for both the enV3 and the enV Touch. They were both very glitchy phones. You might have had a good one, but I know overall, I remember going to the Verizon store like so much to get software updates done. My friend, her and I both had an enV3 at the time, and then I eventually had an enV Touch. But yeah, that was partly me probably just being annoying because I loved phones and I wanted to go to the Verizon store. But we would go in and get software updates all the time because there was always a new one, and we constantly had like that weird issue where you would close your enV3 or your enV Touch, and when you closed it, it would just turn it off. And eventually that was linked to the batteries being slightly loose. Even though you couldn't actually move the battery around, these featured batteries that were actually part of the phone. So when you took off the back of the battery, your phone basically had just a big hole left in it because there wasn't a battery door with a battery under it. This phone, like the battery was the back of the phone. So when you took the battery out, like the back of the phone like was no longer there. And I think the pins for the battery like were just loose or something, and that was what was causing it. No software updates ever fixed that issue for me really. But I didn't own the phone for the total expansion of its lifetime, so maybe it was fixed eventually, but I remember it always being kind of a problem for me. But that being said, I have really good memories of these phones, and they were extremely popular. All right, so, from the time of 2009, the summer of 2009, when the enV Touch and the enV3 were released, things were really changing by the following summer of 2010. And at this point, we weren't even seeing an upgrade to these phones, and a lot of people were kind of like wondering what was going to happen because these phones were so popular, and now there is no rumor of a successor. And I was one of those people too. I remember doing so much research on, enV Touch 2 or enV4, trying to find something. But, at this time, smartphones were becoming very popular, and I don't believe Verizon had the iPhone at this time yet. This was the time frame of the iPhone 4 being released. It wasn't, quite yet on Verizon yet, but it was still an AT&T exclusive. The iPhones like becoming very popular. A lot of Android phones are becoming very popular, and on Verizon especially, people were really, the people that are looking for the top of the line phone used to turn to the Voyager, the enV, the enV Touch to get the best. Like, these people were the people that walk into a Verizon store and they want the best phone. Now, the people that are looking for the best phone no longer are looking for basic phones. They're looking for smartphones. And it's kind of interesting to see because I feel like typically when stuff like this happens, companies are really slow to react. Not always, but I feel like they try to drag out a product, or they're sometimes slightly slower to pick up on market trends, and sometimes that is what leads a company to kind of fall behind. But in this case, I think LG really responded to that very quickly, and they were releasing phones that were smartphones. And I think that's why we didn't see officially another enV phone, is because LG responded to this, as well as Verizon, as I'll mention in a little bit. But we did eventually see what you could consider an enV4, but LG was aware of this. I think Verizon was very much aware of this. And they launched a new version of a keyboard messaging phone called the LG Octane, which was the VN530. And that was released in October of 2010. This phone was only $99.99 after a $50 mail-in rebate on a 2-year contract. They released in one color. I'm considering it brown again. It's kind of similar to the enV Touch color, but this time it was a plastic back that actually did have a battery door and a removable battery. And this phone was not released in any other colors. And another thing that's worth noting is at the time of this release still, they were requiring those $10 a month mandatory data packs for multimedia phones, which were considered advanced feature phones. And this phone was not under that requirement. So I think whatever they did with this phone as far as design or its feature set, it didn't require it. It was still very confusing because this phone did everything that the enV3 did, but the enV3 was still requiring that data pack and then the Octane didn't. Verizon was like a little bit of a hot mess with all of this, and it still like doesn't make sense to me. Their reasoning for certain feature phones requiring it and then certain ones were not. I personally think it was a way for Verizon to kind of make some more money because they were thinking their mentality was like, oh, well, these people have these, advanced feature phones. They want to be able to access the web browser. They need to have a data pack so they're not going over their data amount. But silly because like this Octane did pretty much the same thing. But yeah, this was a really good option for people. Again, this phone was no longer a phone that people were going to because they wanted the top end features. People were probably going to, definitely going to smartphones at this point. So this phone was just a really stable, great phone. I also owned this phone for a short period of time. And it was just really stable. I liked the fact that it had a battery door with a battery under it. I think that was, a big reason why this phone didn't have as many like turn off glitches from what I remember. And this phone was just for a different category of people, and it was a very solid, reliable option for them. And it was definitely a big success in its own right, but I do think it was a really smart move to go ahead and get rid of the enV line name officially, because it just wouldn't have carried on the legacy that the enV phones did before it. And, it's kind of a personal opinion, but I'm glad they stopped where they did with the enV line, and I'm glad this could be the final version of what could be considered the enV4. So this last one I'm going to talk about really surprised me. And I know a lot about the LG enV line, but this one I actually didn't really know about in full until I really did more research on it. So the LG enV Pro was actually supposed to be a phone. So this phone was actually canceled by Verizon, not LG, and it was released as what was called the LG Genesis. It was the US 760 on US Cellular. So Verizon was also, like I said before, catching on that the market was becoming so different and that the target customer for the enV phone, which used to be a customer that wanted the top of the line phone, was no longer looking for an enV phone. People, yes, were still buying Android phones with keyboards, but I think Verizon just did not want to carry on with that naming scheme. They didn't want an enV Touch Pro running Android. And I'm very, very thankful that this phone got canceled. And even though it didn't technically get canceled entirely because this phone, same design, same everything, did still release, but it was not called an enV Pro, and it was released on a different network. So I'm very happy because I think that if this phone had released, it would have just been such a fail. And I don't even mean that because I personally didn't, want it to succeed. I would want this phone to succeed. I, wish the best for every company that releases something. And holding the enV so close in my heart when it comes to tech, like seeing this phone, I can just almost guarantee it would not have sold very well. It would have been kind of sad to see the enV line kind of diminish in that way. But this phone is very, very unique. And it definitely, you can tell this was supposed to be an enV. And this phone, the LG Genesis, was released in June of 2011. and the price was $149.99 after a $100 mail-in rebate on a 2-year contract, and this was for US Cellular, not Verizon. And it released in the color silver. I don't think it actually was officially named the color silver, but it wasn't released in any more colors, and the back of it's silver, so we'll go with silver. But it is kind of fun to see that this design language of the enV Pro, or I guess I shouldn't call it that, the LG Genesis, looked very similar to the design language of the Octane. So yeah, this definitely would have fit alongside that. If you had US Cellular, let me know how this phone was, if you had it, or how it sold, because like I said, I didn't even know this phone was a thing until not that long ago, which is so surprising because I was really keeping up on, a new version of, an enV Touch 2 and stuff like that. But I think, this phone came out in June of 2011. At that time, I probably just assumed it never was going to happen. The enV Touch came out in 2009, and this LG Genesis came out in 2011. So, I can pretty much say that's probably why it fell off my radar, and I never realized that an enV Pro was even in the rumors. Because when this phone was rumored, it was being rumored as an enV Pro for Verizon. At the, close to the last minute, it was canceled, and then, yeah, the LG Genesis happened. And with that being said, I think the enV just was such a solid line of phones. I think it entered the market right when it should have, and it left right when it should have. And it definitely retained that very quality status. I don't think it really, I don't think looking back, anyone would ever consider the enV line a failure. I think had they went in a slightly different direction, or it lingered a little bit too long, I think, that would have been a very different story. Really cool to look back and see the choices that both LG and Verizon made, because they really, they did things super right for this phone, and they did so from the very beginning of its launch to the very end. And that can be, pretty rare for a company and for a product line to do it in that way. So I give them a lot of credit. It's super fun to look back and see. I loved making this video. I hope you enjoyed my rambling. Yes, I could make these videos a lot shorter, but I really like to talk about these phones. And, when you're looking at the history, I don't want to just say the dates and say the colors they came in and stuff like that. It's fun to talk about the experiences of the phone. It's fun to talk about the lifespan, the usage, and, the memories. So if you have any of your own, I would love to hear them. I truly love, to talk about phones, if you can't tell. And I love to hear different people's perspectives, in stories of when they own the phone, or maybe they really wanted to own the phone and didn't. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. It's really cool that other people care about this stuff too. And leave a like and a comment if you want to. And until next time, I'll see you.